A retired cowboy had lived in solitude for years, until 5 Apache widows, weary and desperate, appeared at his ranch door asking for shelter. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Late November, 1882. The frost came early that year. High in the rugged hills of Silver Butte, Colorado territory, Zeke Callahan had sealed his windows tight with oilcloth and stacked the last cords of firewood. He never expected visitors. He never did. The nearest town lay 12 miles down through rock and snow. His closest neighbor had died that past spring. The cabin stood alone against the slope. Solid and weathered, built by Zeke's own hands 6 winters ago, when he walked away from the army and chose goats over men. Zeke was 32. Once he'd worked as a translator Apache Spanish Comanche, used by the military when they wanted treaties, not bullets. But blood had always come anyway. Too much of it. He'd watched young women fall during raids, children dragged into wagons, elders left half-buried beneath their own blankets. When he tried to speak out, no one cared to listen, so he left. Silence became his only companion. That afternoon he was out back, swinging his axe into spruce logs, thick and wet with sap. His gloves were torn at the thumbs. The left heel of his boots was cracked. He split wood in rhythm, not for thought, not for health, just because winter burned fast. A kettle simmered on the stove goat meat waiting to stew when the stillness broke. It wasn't wind. Too steady. Zeke froze mid-swing. He heard it boot steps. Several. Light. Careful. Human. He circled the cabin, his hand hovering near the revolver at his belt, though he hadn't drawn it yet. As he stepped past the rail fence, he saw them. 5 women stood at the clearing's edge, framed by scrub touched with snow. No horses. No wagon. Only bare red feet wrapped in rags. Their dresses were once cotton or buckskin, now patched, torn, crusted with frost. Thin blankets hung from their shoulders, dignity hanging by threads. One of them stepped forward, broad-hipped dark hair, tied back with sinew. Her lips were parched, yet her gaze never wavered. Zeke stood still. She didn't plead. She spoke plain. "We need a place. One night. Nothing more." Zeke studied her, then looked past. The youngest woman's dress bore a dark bloodstain down her thigh. The tallest clutched a twisted arm. Another carried only a cloth satchel. These were no wanderers. They were survivors. He scanned the tree line. No posse. No riders. The last time he'd opened his door, it was for a trapper turned out to be a drunk dodging debt. The man had stolen supplies and left Zeke tied in the barn. But these weren't men. They were Apache widows. He saw it in how they stood proud, untamed, battered, but unbroken. Zeke opened the gate without a word. One by one they entered, wary eyes following his every move. The air carried the smell of blood and pine clinging to their clothes. The eldest, tall and broad, her face marked with years, passed him without thanks. Inside the fire was low. Zeke dropped another log on the flames, moved the kettle aside, and pulled down 6 bowls. He ladled out thick stew root vegetables and meat, and handed it over in silence. They circled the hearth. The one who had spoken knelt near the fire palms, open to its warmth. Her deerskin dress was torn across the chest, stitched once, then ripped again. Sun-browned skin glistened with cold sweat. She didn't cover it. Didn't care. Zeke felt his throat tighten, not with desire, not with shame, but with a simmering anger at whoever had done it. The youngest Tala Skyhawk, though he didn't know her name yet, shook as she sipped. No tears. Just silence and exhausted eyes too wide for her years. They hadn't come seeking charity. They had come because the world left them nowhere else to go. After the meal, Zeke handed out folded wool blankets. No questions. No small talk. He rolled out 2 extra bedrolls from his storage chest spread places by the stove. The floor was hard, but warmer than snow. He laid the last blanket near the woman who had spoken Ahioka. She looked up at him with no fear, only calculation. Her eyes traced his face, his stance, the gun at his hip. She knew he was armed. She knew he was alone. She knew what he could do if he chose. But he didn't. Zeke didn't linger. He simply moved to the window and lowered himself into the chair, rifle stretched across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark tree line in case shadows brought company. Behind him came the rustle of blankets' soft movements as the women settled down. One whispered in broken, tender tones. Another answered with a quick, low laugh, then silence again. It carried the sound of a home long lost. Zeke stayed awake through the night, not fully resting, listening to the fire crack and the winter wind against the boards. He didn't feel fear, not even unease. What pressed down on him was something heavier responsibility, and he didn't send them away. Morning broke sharp and still. Zeke had already been up before the sun lifted over the ridge. He sat in the same chair, boots still on, rifle across his knees. His neck ached, but he didn't stretch it out. He listened. Inside, all 5 women were still curled beneath blankets, their breath slow and steady. The fire had burned to embers. Pia Redbird, tall and sharp-eyed, lay nearest the door like a sentry. Tala Skyhawk, the youngest, slept with her knees drawn tight, her face hidden in her arms. The others were scattered across the floor, wrapped in wool and scraps carried from their journey. Zeke set aside his rifle and stirred the fire back to life, adding water to the kettle. His hands worked by habit, older than fear. By the time the first light streaked across the cabin floor, Ahioka stirred. She rose onto one elbow, hair loose at her shoulders, her deerskin dress wrinkled and still torn across the chest. She made no move to cover herself. Her eyes studied him steady, measuring not timid nor bold. Zeke met her gaze with a short nod. She stood, and without a word he handed her a coffee tin. She knew what to do, measuring the grounds, as though she'd done it here before. When the others woke, the scent of coffee filled the cabin. Steam lifted from tin mugs like ghostly breath. They ate goat stew again. No complaints, not even from the youngest. Afterward, Ahioka stepped outside without speaking. The others followed. Zeke remained behind, watching through the window as they moved with purpose. Ahioka checked the goat pen, whistling low to test the animals. Kaya. Moon gathered a torn blanket from the porch rail, examined the seams, then sat down to mend. Nolly Running Deer dragged a bucket to the well. Pia Redbird circled the cabin, scanning the hills with the eyes of a scout. Even Tala Skyhawk stepped out, hands cupped at her mouth, breathing in the icy air. They weren't guests. They were survivors. And survivors never stayed idle. Zeke returned to his work, splitting logs. Before long, Ahioka joined him. She didn't ask permission, just bent to gather kindling, stacking it by the cabin. Her steps were slow, stiff, with soreness but stubborn. Her torn dress clung to her legs, the rip in the side widening as she worked. If she noticed, she didn't care. She never once looked his way to see if he did. By midday, the sun barely touched warmth onto the earth, but it cleared the frost from the roof. Inside, Zeke laid out what little he had: flour salt, a slab of lard, dried pork. He leaned back, arms crossed, watching, as Nolly and Kaya worked the food like they'd done it 1,000 times, wordless rhythm between them. Questions stacked heavy in his mind. Who were they? Why now? He didn't ask. Not until late afternoon, when Ahioka stood in the doorway as the others worked and gave him an answer. We came from below Fort Garland, she said. There was a raid. White ranchers drunk mean thought we were hiding warriors. Her eyes met his. We weren't. Zeke studied her face, bruised at the temple-old scrapes along her neck. She went on. Most of us lost our men months ago. It didn't matter. Widow or not, they take. He gave no pity, only understanding. They burned our shelter, took the little we had. We walked 5 days. Zeke looked down. 5 days. In that snow. No shoes. Ahioka stepped closer. We saw your smoke from the ridge. We guessed a man lived here alone. We wouldn't have risked it otherwise. You guessed right, Zeke said. A faint smile tugged her lips, gone as quickly as it came. We won't stay long. Just long enough to walk again. Zeke didn't answer. Instead, that evening he brought out extra tools from the shed, an axe nails rope, and set them down without explanation. By dusk, Pia Redbird had patched the back gate. Kaya Moon had sewn a torn curtain, and Nali Running Deer fixed the door latch. They weren't waiting to be saved. They were already building their place. Zeke found himself on the porch with a tin of coffee, watching the women move as if they had always belonged there. Not once did they ask what he expected of them. Not once did he set down rules. Ahioka passed him on her way inside her hip, brushing his knee not entirely by accident, not wholly deliberate either. Their eyes caught for a moment before she disappeared through the door. That night, all 5 women slept beneath his roof. Blankets were pulled closer to the stove. Tala Skyhawk curled up beside Kaya Moon. Pia Redbird stretched out near the door, arms folded across her chest like a guard. Nali, Running Deer, lay flat on her back, eyes open in the dark. Ahioka settled at the far end near the chair where Zeke sat again. She didn't close her eyes right away. Lying on her side facing him, she whispered low, I know what men expect. Zeke stayed silent. I know what folks will say if we linger too long. Still, he said nothing. She studied his scar, the stiffness in his shoulders. With a small nod to herself, she turned away. Zeke sat there a long while staring at the door, then the fire, then the curve of her back beneath the blanket. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was guarding something. He felt part of it, and he didn't send them away. That night, the snow came heavy, swallowing the land in silence. By morning, the world outside was still no wind, no tracks, no sound. Just drifts piled high along the rails and a gray sky that hadn't broken since dawn. Inside, the air was tight and warm. The fire had burned low. The scent of boiled coffee lingered. Wood crackled faintly. No one spoke. Zeke sat at the table pulling a whetstone across his blade in slow, steady rhythm. Across the room, Ahioka stood by the stove, adding water to the kettle. Her dress clung to her legs, damp from brushing snow outside. She hadn't asked before stepping out, just carried the bucket and returned. The others moved quietly. Kaya swept near the hearth. Tala folded a blanket. Pia studied the window's edge for leaks. Nali stood by the door, arms crossed, weighing whether to risk the cold again. Ahioka broke the silence. You get visitors from town. Zeke didn't look up. No. Someone bring you supplies. I ride down once a month. Not till after the thaw. She gave a slow nod. That was all she needed. No one would be checking in. No one would know what happened out here until spring. She turned back to the stove. Zeke watched her move. Strong, not fragile. Her shoulders bore tension, but not fatigue. She wasn't a woman recovering from rest. She was a woman who hadn't had rest in a long time. When breakfast ended, Zeke pulled a map from a chest by his bed. Worn and stained edges frayed, it told the story of years on the frontier. He spread it across to the table and pointed to the valley below Silver Butte. There's a trail down to Carson's Fork. Follow the river south, you'll find some outposts. Ahioka stepped closer. You want us gone? He met her eyes. I'm showing you the way, in case you still plan to leave. She leaned her hands on the table, fingers brushing the blade he had just sharpened. We would have kept walking, she admitted. Her chin tilted toward Tala, who sat by the fire wrapping a strip of cloth around her foot. But the youngest can't anymore. Her wounds are older than we told you. Zeke's gaze dropped to Tala. The cloth around her foot was dark with blood. She caught him watching and tugged her dress lower, ashamed. He turned back to Ahioka. I've got salve. Not much, but it'll help. Ahioka gave one firm nod. We'll work for it. I didn't ask for that. I'm not offering for you, she said, her eyes cutting sharp. I'm offering for her. Zeke didn't argue. He fetched the tin and sat beside Tala on the floor. She shrank back, but he didn't touch her. He only set the salve beside her knee. You do it, he said quietly. Just keep it wrapped after. Tala glanced at him once, then reached for the tin. Pia moved closer behind her, watching him. She said nothing, but her eyes eased just a little. The cabin grew busy that afternoon. Kaya asked for thread and needle. Repairing Zeke's coat with neat patient stitches along the shoulder seam. Nali cleaned shelves. Tala rested. Ahioka stayed mostly outside. Zeke heard the axe bite wood twice, and stepped onto the porch. She was splitting kindling near the shed breath rising in clouds. Her dress was soaked from kneeling in snow, the tear across her chest hanging low, revealing more than she cared to notice. Or maybe she knew and didn't give a damn. She either didn't notice him watching, or didn't care. Zeke Callahan stepped closer, set a fresh log on the stump, and said quietly, That blade's too light. Ahioka gave a grunt. It works. He handed her a heavier axe. She adjusted her grip and brought it down with a clean, practiced swing, the kind that came from survival, not vanity. Zeke gave a single nod. You from White Mountain. Ahioka paused, sweat rising at her collarbone despite the cold. No. Near Fort Apache, before it all turned. Her accent, her bearing, she wasn't a tribal noblewoman, nor a farmer's bride from the valley. She stood somewhere in between. She lifted her gaze. You worked with the army used to. They send you here, no. I left. She didn't ask why. She already understood. They finished splitting the wood and carried the kindling inside together. That night, snow came heavy again. Zeke cooked rabbit he'd trapped earlier in the week. Nali running deer added herbs she had gathered by the shed, and the scent filled the cabin warmer than the fire itself. After supper, quiet settled, not heavy, but steady. Ahioka sat near the flames, one knee bent, legs stretched long. Her torn dress shifted when she moved, bearing the soft curve of her inner thigh. Zeke noticed, but didn't linger. He looked once, then turned away. She studied him in return, not shy, not offering, just testing if he would flinch. He didn't. Later, when the others were asleep, Ahioka poured a small cup of water. She didn't drink it, only held it standing in the doorway, caught between firelight and shadow. "You're not like the others," she said. Zeke didn't stir from his chair. "I've met quiet men. I've met patient ones, but most still expect something sooner or later." He met her eyes. "Do you?" she asked, watching him until her face softened. "I don't know what I expect," she admitted finally, "but I'm not afraid." She stepped closer, close enough he could feel her warmth. Her dress clung to her shaped chest, rising and falling in steady rhythm. Her face bore smoke and travel, but there was beauty there, stubborn, unyielding, earned. Zeke didn't touch her, didn't speak. She stood a moment longer, then turned and lay back down. He sat staring at the fire, unsure if this was trust being built or temptation growing. Either way, he knew one thing: he didn't want them to leave. Not even one. And that thought unsettled him more than it should have. By morning, Zeke woke earlier than usual. At some point, the fire had died, and the cold crept in. The cabin smelled of smoke, heavy and stale. He stretched his neck, scanning the room. They were all still there. Ahioka lay curled, her face turned toward the embers. Pia Redbird, as always, had taken the door. Kaya Moon had shifted in her sleep, an arm laid across Tala Skyhawk's legs in quiet protection. Nali Running Deer rested, flat hands folded across her chest. None stirred as Zeke rose, stoking the fire back to life. As he poured water into the kettle, he heard Ahioka step beside him, close enough their shoulders brushed. Her voice came low. "I thought you'd be gone when we woke." "I don't go far. You always stay on the edge like this." He gave no answer. Outside, snow still fell, the kind that would keep falling until the land itself surrendered. Ahioka poured 2 tin cups of coffee and handed him one without asking, as though they had done it for years. Zeke drank, then finally asked the question he had held back. "You said bounty men hit your shelter. What happened after?" Ahioka sipped slowly. "They came at night, claimed they were hunting 2 men who'd stolen horses near Canyon Hollow. No proof, just whiskey and guns." Her jaw tightened. "They beat Pia first," said she mouthed off. "Then they took Nolly's bag. It had food, not much. They took it anyway." Zeke glanced at Nolly, still sleeping, the bruise faint under her eye. "They burned everything," Ahioka continued. "Didn't kill us. Said we were lucky." "You weren't with a tribe?" Zeke asked. She shook her head. "No tribe takes widows without standing. We had no men left to speak for us." Zeke nodded, his face solemn. He understood too well. On the frontier, protection didn't come from law. It came from who stood beside you. After breakfast, Zeke went to check his traps. Snow had blanketed the valley, but the sky began to clear. He followed the trail to the creek, caught a rabbit and a squirrel enough for stew, maybe a roast if stretched. When he crested the ridge on the way back, he stopped in his tracks. The cabin didn't look the same. Smoke lifted from the chimney as usual, but another thin line curled up from behind the shed. Zeke quickened his pace, hand brushing the grip of his revolver, eyes sharp on the yard. But it wasn't trouble. Ahioka had built a second fire pit, and around it the women worked with quiet rhythm. Nolly Running Deer boiled strips of cloth in a tin bucket. Kaya Moon scraped rabbit skins with the ease of someone who had done it 100 times. Tala Skyhawk sat bundled in blankets by the fire, her bandaged foot tight and clean, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she watched. Kaya rose when she saw Zeke, but didn't speak, only gave him a nod. Moving around back, he found Ahioka kneeling by the woodpile, breaking kindling. "You put this together fast," he said. She didn't look up. "We're not here to waste your food or your wood. Better to cook outside when the sky clears." He handed her the rabbit he'd brought in. She glanced up surprised. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. "You didn't have to stay," he replied. That night they ate better than before rabbit stew with a pinch of crushed pepper Ahioka had hidden in a pouch beneath her skirt. For the first time, they all sat together at the table. No one said much, but when Nolly chuckled at something Kaya whispered in Apache, it wasn't bitter. It was soft, almost light. For the first time in years, Zeke felt a small ease settle in his chest. Later, after the dishes were washed and the floor swept, Ahioka lingered by the fire while the others turned in. She waited until Zeke stepped back toward the stove. "You keep waiting for us to ask for more," she said. He turned. "No." "Yes," she pressed. "You figure one day we'll push too far your bed, your food, your life." Zeke held her eyes. "I don't think that." "Then what do you think?" He didn't answer right away. Firelight caught her face, the faint scar above her lip, the torn edge of her neckline she never bothered to mend. "I know what men see when they look at me now," she said softly. "I know what they want." Zeke's throat tightened, not with lust, but with something older, deeper. "I'm not like them," he said low. "I know," she whispered back. "That's the problem." She stepped closer, the air thick between them, and pressed her cold fingers flat against his chest. His heart beat steady beneath her hand. He didn't move, but he didn't stop her. Slowly she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't shy. Her lips were warm, patient, searching. When she pulled back, she gave no excuse, no apology, only whispered, "Good night," before slipping into her room. Zeke stood rooted. He didn't sleep for hours. But for the first time in years, he didn't sit guarding the door. Instead, he watched the slow rise and fall of her breathing and wondered if maybe he wasn't waiting to be alone anymore. The days that followed moved steady. The snow eased for a while. The mornings were still bitter, but the sky opened wide dusk, stretching longer. A rhythm crept into the cabin: wake, work, eat, sleep. And in between, something unspoken began to take root. They were no longer just surviving. They were living. Ahioka never spoke of the kiss, and neither did Zeke. But the shift was there. She moved closer, more deliberate, her hand brushing his arm when she passed him a tool, her eyes catching his longer than before. And Zeke, he never pulled back. He didn't speak more, but his gaze lingered when she crossed the room. When he stepped outside, he often glanced back, and she was usually watching. One morning, Zeke saddled his horse and rode down into the lower pass. He needed salt, and to check the trap lines near Aspen Grove. He left before sunrise. The women stirred as he pulled on his coat. Ahioka held it steady for him, adjusting the collar with a quiet, steady touch. She didn't ask where he was headed. He didn't tell her. He rode out with the sun rising behind him, cutting fire across the snow. By afternoon, when he returned, the cabin looked different again. Smoke rose from the chimney. The shed door had been patched. Firewood was stacked neatly against the wall, but something else pressed on the air, a quiet that wasn't ordinary. He felt it before he saw it. Zeke dismounted, scanning the yard. The cabin door opened. Paya Redbird stood framed in the doorway, arms crossed. "We had a visitor," she said. Zeke's jaw tightened. "Who? White man, mid-30s, wore a deputy star but no horse. Said he was passing through from Wolf Hollow, claimed he was chasing 2 stolen mules." Zeke stepped past her into the cabin. The others sat quiet. All looked calm, except Tala Skyhawk. her eyes red from crying, though the tears were gone now. Ahioka stood by the window, arms crossed. "He wasn't here for mules," she said flatly. "He saw us through the trees." "He touch any of you?" Zeke's voice was low. Ahioka shook her head. "He just asked why we were here. Said we must be under someone's authority. What did you tell him?" Zeke asked. "That you were our employer, that we cook and clean for roof and bread, that we weren't prisoners, and that he could ride on." Zeke's eyes fell to the table. A ring of melted snow marked where the stranger had set down his cup. A ring of wet snow marked where the stranger had set down his cup. Zeke Callahan stepped onto the porch, scanning the timberline. Nothing stirred. No boot prints near the fence, whether blown off by wind or swept clean, he couldn't tell. But the unease didn't leave him. He stayed outside most of the afternoon, chopping wood, eyes always drifting back to the ridge. Near dusk, Ahioka came out and leaned against the post beside him. She didn't speak right away. Finally, she said, "We should go." "No," Zeke replied. She blinked, arms folding. He could bring more men, more questions. If that was his plan, Zeke said evenly, he wouldn't have come alone the first time. "You think we're safe here?" "I think we're safer than out there." Silence held between them. Then Ahioka said Tala nearly panicked when he asked her name. Froze up. Almost cried. He saw it. He saw she was scared. "She's young," Zeke said quietly. "And she's been hunted before." "She's not the only one," Ahioka answered. "I know," he admitted. That night the fire burned longer than usual. Zeke stayed near the door rifle across his knees. Pia Redbird sat awake too, sharpening a knife. Ahioka rested by the window, eyes open. No one said it aloud, but the cabin felt it. The outside world had noticed them. They weren't invisible anymore. Yet no one ran. The next morning, Zeke took Tala Skyhawk with him to the shed. Just the two of them. He showed her how to brace the door latch, how to read signs in the snow. Broken twigs, shifted prints, changes in the wind. She said little, but her hands steadied. When they came back in, Tala glanced at Ahioka and gave a small nod. Later, while the others mended hides and stitched seams, Zeke and Ahioka stepped behind the cabin. She handed him a cup of root tea. "I was wrong," she said. "About what?" "Thinking we'd be a burden if we stayed too long." "You weren't." "Are we now?" she pressed. Zeke reached out slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His voice was low. "No." She leaned in and kissed him again. This time it lingered. Neither of them looked around to see if anyone noticed. And this time she didn't walk away. She stayed, her hand slipping into his coat pocket, her shoulder pressed to his arm, both of them staring out into the woods in silence. By late December, the snow turned heavy again, wet sheets falling until the land disappeared beneath waist-high drifts. The cabin became a fortress by necessity. For 3 days, no one stepped outside. Wood was rationed. The goats kept in the shed. Water melted from snow. Meals stretched thin. No complaints came. Inside, the women worked steady. Pia built a rack near the stove to dry boots. Kaya Moon boiled herbs wrapped in twine, sharp scents, cutting through smoke. Nali Running Deer patched the roof seams from inside with scrap leather. Tala rested more. Her foot nearly healed now, and her voice grew stronger, asking simple things like where Zeke kept the sugar, or if she could stoke the fire. Ahioka stayed close to Zeke. They didn't share a bed, not yet, but they moved in rhythm. They chopped wood side by side. He handed her a coat lining when she shivered. She brushed snow from his shoulders when he came in from the shed. At night, she sat nearest him, their knees touching under the table. Sometimes her hand rested on his thigh, just briefly, like a promise unspoken. On the fourth day of snow, the question that had been circling silently finally found a voice. Nolly asked it. She stood by the table after supper, drying her hands on her skirt. "What happens in spring?" The room quieted. The stew pot steamed between them. Ahioka looked up. Pia stopped knotting a rope. Kaya held still. Zeke didn't look away. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. Nolly's voice was steady. "That man from Wolf Hollow could return. Others might too. We're 5 Apache widows living in a white man's home. Even if nothing wrong's been done, they won't see it that way. He's done nothing wrong," Ahioka cut in. "None of us have." "But the law doesn't care," Pia said flatly. Zeke leaned back, the chair creaking under him. "I know what the law says. And I know what the land says. Out here, nobody makes it through winter unless they stand together. In spring, we'll make it look how we need to." Ahioka's brow furrowed. "How I've got records, papers. I could write it out, say I've taken on live-in help. 5 hired hands, all legal on paper." Pia raised an eyebrow. "And the town will swallow that, they don't have to," Zeke said. "As long as it's written and stamped, no one looks close unless they want to fight." Ahioka studied him. "You'd do that?" He met her eyes. "Already done something worse, remember. I let you in." That drew a short laugh from Nolly, then another from Kaya. Even Pia cracked a grin. Ahioka didn't laugh. Instead, she stood, crossed the room, and kissed Zeke in front of all of them. Not long, not for show. That night, after the fire burned low and the others drifted to sleep, Ahioka stayed close to Zeke Callahan. She didn't return to her blanket. Instead, she slipped her arms around his shoulders from behind, resting her cheek against the back of his neck. Zeke reached up and touched her forearm. Neither spoke. After a moment, she stepped in front of him and knelt between his legs. The torn deerskin clung to her from long hours of labor and cold. Her chest rose slow and steady, neckline worn low from work and wear. Her skin was warm despite the storm outside, her thighs marked from endless kneeling and surviving. She leaned forward and kissed him again. This time, it deepened. She guided his hands, placing them on her hips, her waist, her back. Zeke didn't rush, didn't grab his touch, was steady, restrained. Her breathing grew heavier. She climbed into his lap, pressing close, still silent. They made love without words, without ceremony, only heat shared in the fire's glow. Skin against skin breath, mingling in the dark. When it ended, she stayed curled against him, her hand flat on his chest cheek, resting on his shoulder. For the first time in years, he held someone not out of duty, but simply to keep. Outside, the storm howled, but inside they had built something strong. By dawn, when the snow eased and pale light cut through the shutters, no one spoke of what had happened, but the air had shifted. They were no longer just surviving winter. They were surviving together. None of them planned to leave. The first clear morning after the storm was bright and sharp. Sunlight carved across the drifts, like a blade casting shadows deep into the white. Snow stood chest-high in places. The path to the well was buried. The shed roof sagged on one side, yet warmth lingered inside, not just from fire, but from something rooted deeper. Ahioka had woken in Zeke's room, though before dawn she had slipped back to her blanket, quietly steady in her breath. The The shift was plain, but no one asked questions. That silence was respect. By mid-morning, they were outside cutting through the snow. Zeke shoveled a path from the porch to the shed. Pia Redbird broke ice from the roof eaves. Kaya Moon and Nolly Running Deer cleared the goat pens. Tala Skyhawk, bandage off for the first time in days, limped along the trail, Zeke carved pale, gripped in both hands, cheeks red from the cold, yet smiling. It was Ahioka who noticed the tracks first. Near the north fence, raking slush from the posts, she spotted boot prints fresh deep, not theirs. She didn't shout. She walked back to the porch, caught Zeke's eye. He read it in her face before she spoke. Together they followed the prints along the property line. Whoever it was had come from the south, circled wide, then turned back. They hadn't come close. They hadn't knocked. Just watched. Same man, Ahioka asked. Could be, Zeke muttered. Could be worse. They trailed the prints to the ridge before the wind began to bury them. Too late to follow farther. Back inside, the women gathered by the fire. Tala's face was drawn, her hands clenched. Nolly crossed her arms tight. Kaya held the same piece of stitching too long without threading it. Zeke set his rifle on the table. If someone's watching, they didn't want to be seen. Yet, Pia said. Ahioka folded her arms. They're not chasing mules anymore. Zeke looked at each of them in turn. You don't have to wait for me to tell you. If you want out before spring, before this turns worse, I'll help you pack-load the wagon and I'll ride with you as far as Fort Kavanaugh. No one moved. Kaya spoke first. Leave what go back where? There's no tribe waiting, Pia added. Even if we left, we'd be split apart again. Some taken in, some not. Tala said nothing. She simply walked to Zeke, slid her small hand into his wrapping, two of his fingers. Zeke looked down, startled. I don't want to go, she said softly. He held her gaze. Then you don't. Ahioka nodded. Neither do I. The others didn't speak, but they didn't need to. That night, Zeke checked the windows twice. He moved his rifle closer to the door, sharpened the old hunting knife he hadn't touched in months. Ahioka carried in more wood. Pia blocked the chimney's lower flue in case smoke was used against them. They weren't panicked. They were preparing. Later, when the cabin dimmed back to firelight, Zeke sat on the edge of a bedroll head in his hands. His breath came slow, not from fear but from the weight of it. He had lived years with no one else in this space, years where the only voice was his own or the wind through the boards. Now the room was full, 5 women, each scarred, each strong, each surviving, and somehow they trusted him. Ahioka came quietly, knelt at his side. Her hand rested on his thigh, steadying him. You didn't ask for this, she said gently. No, Zeke murmured, but I didn't turn from it either. He looked at her in the glow of the fire, her hair, loose bruises fading her presence, no longer fragile. Her torn dress, scarred and worn, no longer looked broken. It looked like armor that had endured. Ahioka leaned forward and kissed him. Slow, certain. When they parted, she whispered, We stay. If they come, we stand. Zeke cupped the back of her neck, rested his forehead against hers. He didn't say thank you. He didn't need to say more. Outside, snow fell again. But inside, they were ready not just to endure, but to hold on to what had become theirs. By the second week of January, the storm broke for good, leaving behind hard-packed, earth-thawing streams running beneath crusted ice and steam rising off the cabin roof in the sharp sun. Light lasted longer now, clearer, pulling them toward spring. Yet the sense of being watched never fully left. Every day after the thaw, Zeke Callahan walked the ridge trail twice, once at dawn, once before dark. Rifle in hand, eyes sweeping the tree line. But no prints turned up, no broken branches, no drag marks. Whoever had come before was either gone or hiding better now. Inside the cabin, life found rhythm. Tala Skyhawk had healed and no longer limped. She worked beside Pia Redbird, hammering boards back into the goat shed. Kaya Moon baked with the last of the flour biscuits that made Zeke admit they reminded him of his mother's, though Kaya only gave the faintest nod at the compliment. Nali Running Deer usually quiet carved symbols into the wall with the tip of her knife. She never explained them, and no one asked. Ahioka stayed closest to Zeke. They no longer circled each other. At night she lay in his room. The same torn dress she'd worn since the beginning stayed unrepaired, not because she couldn't mend it, but because she knew he saw her as she was and never asked her to change. Every night he kissed her, sometimes slow, sometimes long, sometimes with a deep need that burned quiet. They never spoke of love, but it lived in how they moved together, the way she reached for his hand when her fingers were cold, the way he stirred her coffee before handing it over, the way their knees brushed beneath the table. One late night fire low, her head on his chest, Ahioka finally asked the question the others had been carrying. When spring comes and that lawman returns, what do we tell him? Zeke ran a hand through her hair. Depends on the question. He'll ask if we're yours, if we belong here. Zeke thought for a long time, then said quietly, You do. All of us, she pressed, lifting her gaze. Not just workers, not just mouths to feed. Do you mean it? I mean it, Zeke said. The next morning, he pulled out the ledger from the chest beneath his bed. Old army papers, land filings, a faded county stamp. At the table, while the women sewed and mended, he began writing. One by one, he filled in their names, Ahioka, Kaya, Nali. Pia Tala recorded them as permanent residence kin under household protection. Not ownership, but recognition. Not possession, but safety. When he finished, he handed the papers to Pia. She read them silently, then nodded and passed them on. By nightfall, each woman had held the page bearing her name, and not one of them began to pack. The next day, Zeke hitched the wagon and rode the long miles down to Canyon Post. It took most of the day. By the time he returned, the papers were stamped, dated, filed. Legal. By dusk, they were no longer just a band of survivors under one roof. They were a household. That night, Ahioka waited by the fire. She didn't speak. She untied her dress slowly and stepped into his arms. He kissed her like it was the first time, touched her like he had waited all his life to be chosen. They made love again, slower, steadier, without fear between them. She guided his hands, showed him every scar, every curve, unflinching. When they lay together in the glow of the flames, she whispered, You know what they'll call us. Let them, Zeke said, pressing his lips to her shoulder. She smiled, tired but proud. You gave us more than a roof, and you gave me more than silence, he answered. In the corner, Tala stirred in her sleep. Pia turned over in her blanket. Nali snored once. Kaya mumbled softly and rolled to her side. And the cabin, once a place haunted by loneliness, now felt like home. Not borrowed, not temporary, real. By the end of that week, Zeke knew the thaw had truly come, because no one spoke of leaving anymore. They already belonged. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the smell of wet earth, the sound of trickling water on the ridge, the faint return of bird song at dawn. By mid-March, snow was nearly gone from the valley, and green shoots pushed up through the stone. The cabin, weathered and smoke-dark from winter, stood proud beneath the open sky. The danger hadn't returned. The stranger from Wolf Hollow never showed again. No riders came. No accusations came. No trouble followed. Yet Zeke Callahan kept his guard the way a man seasoned by loss always would. Every dawn he checked the tree line. Every dusk he walked the path to the creek and back, not out of fear, but habit. Protection to him was never about panic, it was about presence. Inside the cabin bore quiet changes that spoke of permanence. Tala Skyhawk strung a wind chime of carved bone and twine over the window. Kaya Moon dried herbs above the stove. Nali running deer carved symbols into the walls, sometimes with charcoal, sometimes with color. Pia Redbird rebuilt the porch and shaped a bench by hand. Ahioka planted corn in a neat row near the shed, the soil softening more each week. And Zeke, he found himself smiling again. Not wide, not often, but real. These women had carved space for him without demanding he change, and because of that he had changed. The man who once recoiled from touch no longer flinched. The one who spoke few words now carried the weight of family without naming it. Word traveled, as it always did, down to Canyon Post. Folks whispered that Zeke Callahan had taken in 5 Apache widows. Some called it pity, some called it scandal, others muttered it was marriage without vows. But by April, gossip turned to silence. When Mr. Whitlock, the town clerk, rode up for a routine check, he found the cabin clean, the papers in order, and the women working the land with pride. Respect written on every page Zeke had filed. No law broken. Nothing to say. One evening, with the sky washed in orange, Zeke found Ahioka rinsing cloth in a basin. Water clung to her hands, her dress dark at the hips. She looked over her shoulder as he approached. "You're breathing heavy," she teased. "Been hauling stone," he answered. "You sound like an old man." "I am an old man," he said with a grin. "Not that old," she replied, eyes narrowing playfully. He stepped closer. "I want to ask you something. You can't ask me to leave," she said, crossing her arms. "It's too late for that." He shook his head. "I want you to marry me." Her gaze sharpened, not shocked, not smiling yet. "Is this about the law? Numb. To keep others away, no." Then why Zeke swallowed. "Because you're the strongest person I've ever met. Because when I wake, I look for you first. Because when I think of 10 winters from now, I want this. All of it. You." Ahioka's breath came slow. She stepped forward, pressed her forehead against his chest, fingers curling into his shirt. "I never planned to belong to anyone again," she whispered. "But I'll be yours. Only if you want," he murmured. "I want," she said. Then, with a sly look, "But I won't wear white." He chuckled. "Didn't ask you to. And I'm not fixing this dress," she added, tugging at the torn neckline. Zeke's eyes lingered on her shoulder, the rip across her chest, the sunlight warm on her skin. "I wouldn't want you in anything else." They wed beneath the tall spruce behind the cabin 2 days later. No preacher, no crowd, just the land, and those who had become family. Pia stood close, arms crossed, but smiling. Kaya wove a small braid into Ahioka's hair. Apache tradition passed woman to woman. Nali carved a circle into the bark permanent. Tala laid wildflowers at their feet. Zeke spoke simply. "You stay with me, and I'll stay with you." Ahioka answered. "Then we stay." The sun warmed them. The land accepted them. The wind shifted, but carried nothing away. That night, as dusk settled over Silver Butte, Zeke sat on the porch with Ahyoka, leaning back against his chest. Laughter drifted from inside, and someone, maybe Nali, sang a soft tune. Ahyoka's hand rested lightly on her stomach. Zeke noticed, but didn't ask. In a few months, she whispered. He held her tighter. "You scared not anymore?" Zeke stared across the field where green shoots of corn had just broken the earth. "They won't understand," he muttered. "They don't have to," she answered with a quiet smile. And they sat in silence. Two souls who had lost everything, and yet found what mattered most. They stayed. And that was love. That was home. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.